Hi, it's Grandma Karen. I hope you had a fun time designing your first quilt. In this lesson, we will learn to sew the squares and rectangles into rows. I will show you how to avoid and fix common mistakes in sewing seams. I am using an all-purpose foot, cotton thread, a universal needle, and a stitch length of about 2.5 millimeters or about 10 to 12 stitches per inch if you have an older machine. My machine and my foot control are in a comfortable place. I'm going to show you two ways to sew squares into rows. As you watch, you may think it's a lot to remember, but this method keeps it efficient and organized. This is one row of my quilt. I lay the row out in front of my machine with a label on the left. The heads of the pins that are holding the squares together are at the top of the row towards the machine. I have unpinned the last square in the row and set it down on the right side. Okay, so let's review. I've laid out my first row here. So this is the right side of the fabric. This is the wrong side of the fabric. I have this laid out with my label right here at the left side. And I have all the heads of the pins at the top of the row. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unpin this first square. And I'm going to take this right square and put it on top of the left square. I leave the pins in the rest of the row while I'm sewing. You can try unpinning it, but this really keeps things straight. I will not be showing pinning as I show you these two methods, just so that it helps you learn the process of putting them in the machine. Okay, I need to match the top and the bottom. That I know those are the two places that match. And then I'll kind of use my fingernails and make sure that that is all lined up all on that edge. I even turn it over sometimes and make sure that it's matched on the back. Start exactly at the top of the seam, and I found my 1/2 inch line on my machine, which is my second line. If you don't remember where yours is, then you can measure it, or you can go back to lesson 10 and review that. And sometimes I have to look in front here a little bit to get that, look in that little oval hole there, and I'm going to sew. I make sure that my tails are back here and under my foot. I hold them as I start, and as I sew along here, I'm using my steering hand and my straightening hand, make sure everything's going in there, and I'm going to sew all the way to the end. As I sew, my eyes are looking right here, the edge of the fabric along the edge of this guideline. I'm not looking at the needle, I'm not looking at the line on my presser foot. And I'm going to sew all the way to the end of this seam. And I might again have to lean forward just a little bit to look and use my hand wheel even. I'm going to lift my presser foot, pull it out about 3 inches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the threads close. A lot of times people like to use the thread cutter on their machine, but I prefer to use scissors because I can get close to the edge. And then I'm going to go to the very top of my seam also, and I'm going to clip the threads up there. So the reason that I cut that thread right there is because if I don't, that thread often gets caught in the seams when I'm sewing my rows together, and then you have to cut all those threads. So I try to always cut the top. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open that up, and there's our seam that we just sewed. And I'm going to unpin this next one. And I'm going to take the right and put it on top of the left. And I'm going to match up the top. I know that's where it matches. I know it matches right there. Get that a little bit closer there. Take this, put it under my presser foot, hold my tail, and I'm going to go to the end there. Go all the way to the end, lift my foot, pull it out about 3 inches, and then I'm going to use my scissors to cut the bottom and cut the top. And there we have two sewn together. And see how I just keep all of my double pinned pieces together and as I go, and then nothing gets mixed up. This method is used many times in sewing, and it teaches you good habits in sewing seams. Now I'll be showing you chain piecing. Chain piecing has two advantages. One is it uses less thread. 2, it is faster and more efficient. Instead of working on one row at a time like we just did, You will be building several rows at a time. Usually you're going to do 3 to 4 rows at a time. You can do as many as you want. If you're doing a table runner that only has 2 rows, that's okay too. I've chosen to do 3 rows to show you today. So I start with one of my rows. It doesn't really matter what order you do your rows in. It doesn't matter if I'm doing row 2 next. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to make sure my label is on the left, and then I'm going to take, and all my pin heads are at the top. I'm going to unpin this one, and this one happens to be a rectangle. Take that right one, put it on top of the left one. My right sides are together. Always match where you know it's supposed to match. I know it matches at the top. I know it matches at the bottom. I'm going to put my threads under there, press your foot down, hold those threads as I start. I'm going to sew to the end of this seam. And when I get to the bottom of the seam, I am going to stop. So stop, don't undo your threads. Don't cut your threads. So I'm going to take the next row. I've got my label on the left. I'm going to take my farthest right square or rectangle, right sides together, match the top, match the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift my presser foot up a little bit, and I'm going to slide that in so that it is along the seam line right there. And I am going to just start sewing. When I get to the end, I am going to leave it in, leave my presser foot down, not going to cut anything. Take my next row, my label's on the left. I take my last square, unpin it, take right square onto left square, line up where I know it's supposed to line up, line it up at the top, line it at the bottom, scoot that over, and if you have a knee lever, like I do on this machine, you can use it instead of reaching your hand through to lift up your presser foot. You can use your knee lever and just slide it under there. And then I'm going to sew to the end. Now I'm only doing 3 rows. If you're doing more rows, you can just keep going. When I get to the end of these 3 rows, then what I do is I'm going to take my rows like this, and I'm going to cut this little chain stitch right here that's holding these 2 rows onto the one that's under the foot. I'm just going to cut that one. And then I'm going to take this one. There's a little chain in front of that one too. So you can see right here, there's just a little teeny chain of stitches. Sometimes it's a little bit longer. I'm just going to trim that right there. Now I have 2 rows again, and I can just take this one, open up what I've already done, and I haven't cut that thread, so I'm going to cut that thread at the top, unpin the right one, put it on top of the left one. Again, line up where I know it's supposed to match. Match at the top, match at the bottom. Lift this up a little bit. Slide that under there. Make sure my seam allowances are in the right place on the guide. Go to the end. And then I would do the same thing. My label on the left. The heads of the pins at the top. Open up what I've just done, unpin, right one goes on the left one, right sides together. The reason I like this one is because they are right in position to go in there every time. And so you would just do the same thing, put these through, cut them off, cut the 2 off, start again until you're done at the end of the row. When you're on your last seam, then you can grab 2 more rows or 3 more rows and slide those in if you have more rows to do. I timed myself once. It took 6 minutes to sew 9 squares together using the first method, cutting threads after sewing each 2 squares. Then I sewed 3 rows with chain piecing, and it took 12 minutes. That means each row took only 4 minutes instead of 6. It's much faster to chain piece. Chain piecing works well when making quilts. You can try both ways. Remember, I didn't pin in this, and pinning takes a little bit longer. You can try whichever way works best for you. Using pins holds the 2 squares together so they don't slip apart when I'm sewing. I do not sew over pins. I have to stop to take the pins out. Pinning takes a little longer, but it really does help the edges stay together better. If I'm sewing very small squares like these together, I do not use pins. Every sewing machine is a little different. Some machines don't push the fabric through as well as others, but pinning will help with this. There are several ways to pin. Pinning takes practice. If you're left-handed, there will be a shorter version of this lesson that shows pinning options for left-handed sewers. For 5-inch squares, I usually use 3 pins. If I'm sewing 10-inch squares together, like these 2 big ones, then I might use 5 or 6 pins to hold them together. When your edges don't stay together, just use more pins. Some sewers put the pins in vertically along the seam. If you pin this way, place the heads of the pins pointing towards you. I don't use this method very often. Some sewers put the pins in horizontally. The pin heads should stick out enough from the edges so that you will be able to pull the pins out as you sew. This is a good way to use pins. This photo shows my favorite way to pin. The pins are put into the seam at a 45-degree angle. The heads need to be hanging off the edge of the fabric enough so that you can pull the pins out easily. I like this way best because you can leave the pins in a little bit longer. Remember, we do not sew over the pins. We use our right hand, the straightening hand, to pull the pins out. So let's try vertical pinning first. So I'm going to match up my top and my bottom, and I've drawn a line on these 3 so that you can kind of see where we're trying to get the pins for 1/2-inch seams. So I'm going to put my pin in this way. Some people find it easier to hold it this way when they're pinning. You decide which works for you. And I'm going to put 3 pins in. You might be able to get away with just 2 pins. Let me make sure those are matched up well. And that's the way they look. So I'm going to put these into my machine now. And as I come to these pins, I need to take them out. Remember, as we sew, we do not sew over the pins. So when I get there, I kind of have to stop. If you've sewn for a long time, sometimes you can pull them out as you're coming to them without stopping all the way. All right, so that's our vertical pinning. Let's talk about putting the pins in horizontally. So I've drawn that line here, and when you do this, what you're going to do is you're going to stick this straight down like this, and then you're going to aim it through. And what you want is you want the bite of the pin, the part that you can't see right there, going under the seam line. See how it's going under there? Let me do the next one so you can see that again. So I'm holding them together, putting the pin straight down, and taking the bite where you can't see the pin is going underneath the seam line. Same on this side. That's where the seam line is. And if it's easier for you to pin holding it this direction, whichever way works for you, let's put this in here. So I'm going to put that in, start at the top, hold my threads, and as I come to this pin, before it comes to the needle, I'm pulling it out. And I didn't really do very well keeping on my guidelines, so I'll show you what I do for that. And it's nice to have your pin cushion, whatever pin cushion you're using, right here next to you so that as you pull those pins out, it goes right in the pin cushion. Okay, so I know that there's a part in here where where I was kind of sewing off the line. So I'm just going to put a pin there. And when I come back to it later, I can see if it really needs to get fixed or not. So as you're sewing and you see that there is a place where you went really off the line, then it's actually right there. So I just put a pin in there. Later I can fix that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, so my favorite way to pin is diagonally. And so I'm going to hold this like this, stick my pin straight in. Instead of going straight across, I'm angling my pin up like that. And again, the bite is going to go right there. If I turn it over, you can see that is right there where the pin is crossing underneath on the line where the seam allowance is. And I will put the next one in like that, hold them, and aim up. And if you prefer to hold your pieces like this, that works too. Pin straight down and over. And there's my pins. So let's watch how this one works. All right, so I'm going to start at the top here, and I'm going to sew. And watch, see, I can leave that pin in a little bit longer, and I'm going to reach in here and pull this out. I'm going to sew along, and again, I can reach in here and pull that out. And sometimes I can just even leave it in and just go really slow and pull that out. I have two things to help you if your squares come apart or get mixed up while you're sewing. First, I have the rows labeled. I also know that the pin heads are at the top of the row. If some of my row comes unpinned, I look at the label and know what side the square goes on to the row. If the label comes off, I know that the pin heads are at the top, so I know to put the label on the left square or rectangle. Second, if things get really messed up, I can refer to the photo I took when I laid out my quilt. So let's look at some problems you might find in sewing. So I matched my top, but when I get here, I find that it's not matched up. So that means something is wrong with my squares. So I pull this ruler out and I'm going to measure, and I know that my bottom square is 5 inches and my top square is only 4.5. So you or your mentor will have to get another square to put on here to replace this one. If I find it the opposite way, if I find that this top square is the correct size and the bottom square is not the correct size, then I just have my mentor slice off a little bit of that to make it the right size. If you find that your squares are almost exactly the same size, but this top one is just a little bit smaller than the bottom one, then I usually center that on here so that I have the same amount of fabric sticking out at this end as I do at this end. And the reason you can do that is because we are going to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance when we sew our rows together. So that little extra we can deal with. The next issue you might run into is that this seam did not start at the top. And down here, that seam did not go all the way to the end. How do I fix that? I'm going to take my presser foot and I'm just going to set it down there. And I'm going to go about maybe 1/2 inch or a little bit more and set it so that it's right exactly on that stitch line. And I'm just going to sew until I get all the way to the end. Then I'm going to cut my threads here. Cut my threads at the top also of the stitch. And that's all you have to do to fix that. You don't have to undo any of your stitching. And then I would do the same thing at this side, but I would turn it over and I would start right there and sew all the way to the end. Okay, so this one, when this happens, I get embarrassed. But can you see that as I sewed these rows together, that one looks good and that one looks good. But this one, what did I do? I didn't put my right sides together. I put my wrong sides together. So I'm going to have to actually unsew this. We call that unsewing or unpicking. And I will show you how to use a seam ripper in lesson 14, and we'll see how to undo that. So this would have to get taken out and redone with right sides together. It happens every once in a while. So this one looks pretty good. It looks fine on this side, but if I turn it over, you can see that I did not have it pinned, or I didn't have it pinned well, and the edges slipped away from each other. So I would have to start here and take about right here. These edges are fine, but from here down, I would have to take those stitches out and then repin it and resew it. And I'll show you how to do this when we do unpicking in lesson 14. What do you do if the seam's too narrow? Here's a pin that I had put in here knowing that I had made a mistake while I was sewing. So it should be looking like that, and it's going like this. So I'm going to do pretty much the same thing I did with my stitches not going all the way to the end. I'm going to start up there. I'm lining it up so that my needle is right in the seam line. I know that's good because it's along the guideline, and I just sew along here. A lot of people want to take those stitches out, but you don't need to take those stitches out until you fix it. If you do it before the stitches are taken out, then you can do it without putting pins in. So here we go. There's my seam right here, my new seam that I said. So you make sure you start up here and go a little bit farther into your stitches, and then you're going to cut your threads. What do you do if you've made your seam a little too big? Here's my pin saying I made a mistake. Again, I'm going to start here. I know that I'm lined up right here, so I will probably go about there, and I will stitch, and I'm watching this guideline. I'm not looking out here. I'm looking at the guideline, and I'm just going to keep going until I get lined up again. And this looks like I'm going to need to go all the way to the end on this one. So what happens now with this one, I will have to take these stitches out. And we'll talk about that later. So one more. A lot of times people are sewing along and they get to the very last one and they kind of start pulling it away before they get to the end. And what happens is, you can see I've made a line here. That blue line is where the stitching should have gone. And when we open these up later, this will be a little too big and it won't fit when we sew our rows together. So try not to pull it off a little bit as you're coming to the end. There are products that can be added next to this line on your machine to help you guide your fabric a little easier. And some sewers need this, and it helps them to know which line that they need to use. So the first way is to just take 8 layers, 10 layers of masking tape, and I've put this on parchment paper so that I can store it when I'm not using it. And you're just going to put those lined up with your line. You want a little bit of it coming behind the needle, so right here, but you want a lot of it coming in front. And it's sometimes a good idea to put a ruler here so that you can make sure that that's straight. And then I'm going to start sewing. And as I sew, my edge goes right along that little bit of a ridge. It's not very high ridge. Now I'll show you some other ones to use. That one. My friend, she just takes an insert from a zipper and she puts this on the machine just with duct tape and she lines it up along there. And you could just take cardstock and do the same thing. The key is to make it straight. So again, this is just enough of a ridge to help you keep that straight on there. There is a product that is like a foamy thing with a sticky back, and you can line that up on there. So let's see if this one, sometimes it might interfere with you pulling out the pins. Try it and see. But this is my favorite way. And I just keep this on top of my machine. This is a vinyl cling product. And when I put this on, I make sure it's straight. And it sticks up just enough, and I can see it pretty well, that it helps me guide my fabric. Now, if all of this else fails, you can actually draw your lines onto your squares with a ruler. I would not use a disappearing or a washout marker because you're going to be pressing these, and those will have to be washed out before you press them. So one of the things you could use is you could use a chalk marker or a chalk pencil that isn't going to become permanent by pressing it. At times, some machines pull the fabric down into the bobbin area where the needle goes when you begin to sew. It eats the fabric. My machine sometimes does this when I'm sewing triangles or diamond shapes together that start with a pointy edge. Your mentor can help you if this happens with your machine. The best way to help with your machine eating your threads and your fabric is to use what is called a starty-stoppy, a leader ender, or a helper scrap. And basically it's just folding your fabric into 4 layers. So I'm going to start somewhere in the middle or towards the end, and I'm just going to sew till I get to the end. This is kind of like chain piecing. And then I'm going to align my edge on whatever seam allowance I need, lift my foot up a little bit, place that under there, and then I'm going to sew on to my fabric. Then I would just chain piece away, and when I get to the very last one that I'm going to sew, I am going to reach behind here, and I'm going to cut off my starty-stoppy, and then I'm going to sew onto my starty-stoppy. I'm just going to push that under there as I'm sewing, and then it is ready for my next one. And I know many people who use their starty-stoppy every time they start a seam and every time they end a seam. And it really does help with that problem. And some machines need that help. You've seen me sew the squares and rectangles into rows. Now it is your turn. Here is your homework. 1. Sew your squares and rectangles into rows with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. 2. Mark any problems you see with your seams with a pin to fix it later. I hope you enjoyed sewing your squares and rectangles into rows. Before we sew our rows together to form our quilt top, we will have to iron or press our seams. Our next lesson is about the difference between pressing and ironing. We will learn about products that help us press and learn a little bit about what we call the grain of the fabric. See you next time. Here is a note to the mentor. For lesson 13, you will need an iron, an ironing board or tabletop ironing board, any spray starch project you have, any pressing tools you have, such as a clapper or a seam board. You'll need a large scrap of fabric that includes a salvage edge, a marker to mark the parts of the fabric on the scrap. The products on the next slide are listed for your information and not necessarily endorsed. Thank you for helping someone learn to sew.